Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Harlots and Hearses. It's me, your host, Grace Artis. So sorry about the delay on this one. I was sick earlier this week when I was supposed to film, and I could not say more than 5 words without coughing. And then I was supposed to do it yesterday, but none of the audio recorded. So this is very much like a take two, second chance episode. So fingers crossed, if you're hearing this, that means my audio worked. Without further ado, this topic is something that is very, very near and dear to my heart because it is actually what I did my master's thesis over. So today we are going to be talking about 18th century cures for venereal diseases. Just a few of them. There are so many out there. These were the ones that I primarily focused on for my topic. And I have always been interested in this topic, mainly because of its ties to and its connotations with prostitution and how that related in the 18th century culture of everything. But without further ado, we are going to dive in, and I hope you find this as interesting as I do. So, a little background context over everything. So, it's said that in 18th century London, venereal diseases infected 1 in 5 of the population. It affected the city so much that the cures for this disease took up more column space in the English press than any other type of periodical at this time. And when I meant that, it was either like poems surrounding the disease, different cures for the disease, just conversations surrounding it. It was very rampant and everywhere. And even diving deeper into that and how it affected women, historian Kevin Sienna and Simon Streiser estimate that 5 to 10% of London's female population over 35 had a venereal disease in this period, which meant it was 2 to 4 times higher than the occurrence rate of men. Now, venereal disease in this period was often referred to as the secret disease or the secret malady. And that is because of just how little women talked about this. It was viewed as a very shameful thing to have, and it was just something you didn't talk about in polite society if you were affected. And venereal diseases, it was kind of this all-encompassing term, but when I'm mentioning this, I'm talking about gonorrhea, syphilis, scabies, and chlamydia. When one was diagnosed in this period, it was often done through what is called symptomology. So just listing the symptoms and figuring out what's wrong with you. And that led the clumping of multiple diseases into one, a venereal disease. So you could list multiple symptoms, and instead of saying like, oh, it's gonorrhea specific or it's syphilis specific, they would just say the all-encompassing term, it's just a venereal, you have a VD. The 3 most commonly attributed symptoms of venereal diseases were cankers, burning or painful urination, and or like the swelling of the groin area with discharge. So all really, really fun stuff. But one of the most frequently reported symptoms at this time, and this was kind of appeared as the initial outbreak symptom, especially with gonorrhea infections, was a painful burning urination. And syphilis, focusing on syphilis, that was kind of a little bit more varied as far as symptoms go, just because syphilis happens in 3 stages, and those could take weeks to manifest themselves. But one of the symptoms that was heavily associated with syphilis, at least in the first stage, was a canker or a chancre or cancer. And those are just ulcer-like sores that would appear, along the genitalia, around the mouth, the fingers, and the buttocks of infected women and men in this period. The third symptom was called the itch, which we associate that kind of nowadays with scabies, but they lump that in with venereal diseases as it was transmitted during sexual acts. So to understand kind of how it was treated, we have to once again go back even further and look at kind of like the medical marketplace at this time and how it was set up. And this is going to sound really familiar to and kind of an ode to the Burke and Hare episode I did, because the same tactics apply. The Londoners at this time turned to several fields of knowledge, and at this time there was a very much growing and diverse medical marketplace to combat venereal disease. So members of the elite classes, they often consulted personal physicians, principally doctors that held official licenses from the Royal College of Physicians, and they often charged very, very high rates. The lower classes utilized voluntary hospitals, such as St. Thomas or St. Bart's, and there are records for both of those hospitals of treating cases of venereal disease. At these hospitals, it was typically free of charge, but with that, it also became a really long wait times for patients to even consult with a physician or a surgeon. And because of the stigmatizing nature of venereal diseases, many Londoners, especially women, because remember, if you're a woman of polite society, if you're a woman of anything that is not like of the sex worker variety, it's very stigmatizing to have these diseases. So they would only visit the hospital or sought treatment if it was absolutely necessary. Because if we go back to like the Birkin hair episode, like I said, treatment at this time and the doctor practitioner field was very hierarchical. So on the surface, you have the three ranks. You have physicians, you have surgeons, and you had apothecaries. They all very much served their own individual role. And as I'll kind of dive into later, the lines did start to blur, but initially they were all the system was a little bit more rigid. At the top of this like medical hierarchy, if you will, were the elite members of the Royal College of Physicians, or as a medical historian Elizabeth Ferdell tells them, the philosopher kings of medicine. So these men, like I said, they would attend Oxford or Cambridge. They had 7 years of study at the institution, and then they would pass a 3-part examination. This was done in Latin over pathology, physiology, and therapy. And in the beginning, like their manner of diagnosis and treatment very heavily followed the Galenic humoral theory. And so this was the belief that the body was formed of 4 humors / bodily fluids. And those were blood, phlegm, yellow, and black bile. And so the theory was if that you were in good health, all the humors were balanced. Everything was perfectly aligned. If you were in bad health, that meant that something was out of balance with those humors, and it was then the physician's duty to rebalance the body and restore health. And because of this type of medicine, purgatives were a large part of the treatment process. So it was theorized that by purging the body, you were going to expel any bad humors that misaligned it. So purgatives are things such as vomiting, inducing diarrhea, the leech theory, the leeches, bloodletting, because you're purging the body of bad blood. Now, come the 1670s, there was a shift of now starting to focus on looking for specific cures for specific diseases. And this also goes back and will tie to kind of still the hierarchical nature of things. So the physician's primary role in all of this was to intend the interior body and diagnose and prescribe treatments. So they weren't necessarily in there getting hot and heavy, like thoroughly looking at the body. They were just like hearing the symptoms and being like, this is what I would prescribe. Very, very much looking internally. And it was because of the nature of their like intellectual education and kind of like diagnosing from afar, if you will, that they were often deemed out of touch with the patient interactions and human anatomy. And that was a very, very common retort that was given by surgeons of this period of why you should seek out a surgeon rather than a physician. Now, for treatment, so once you were diagnosed, if you will, then you would either consult a surgeon or an apothecary. These were the ones and the people who were dealing with the exterior of the body. And it was these people who boasted of having the most personal care with patients, and they would claim to have spent more time dealing with human anatomy of the body. Now, the person who handled, the cutting of the body and surgery, if you will, the name goes, is the surgeon. They were the closest also associated with venereal diseases because they were, and their job was to treat external complaints. So skin conditions, boils, wounds, injuries, things of that nature, which if you think of, a lot of the symptoms of venereal disease are external complaints like the cankers that we talked about, the ulcers, discharge coming from the body. With syphilis, you can also develop like buboes, like little boils, and they would also be cut off. So that also heavily aligns with the surgeons. And then if you wanted medicine or anything of that regard, that's when you would consult the apothecary. And they were the ones in charge of kind of making the medicines, making the poultices, having all the herbs and knowledge, and then divvying it out and giving that and prescribing it. And they also often argued for their right to prescribe and treat medical conditions since no one knew the medicines as much as they did. Now, it's also really important to note that in this period, so like the 18th century, you start to see a huge shift and a blurring between the lines of practitioners, especially between like apothecaries and surgeons. And this was because they noted that it was really helpful for a medical practitioner to be skilled in physic, pharmacy, surgery, and midwifery. So kind of becoming that all-around encompassing good doctor. We also see what fostered this even more is the rise of a different type of medical university that was seen in Scotland, specifically Edinburgh. And this goes back to Burke and Hare, how that the Edinburgh School of Surgery was trying to create a new type of doctor. So the one that was essentially, that was going to combine physic and surgery together. So kind of mending and marrying the physician's role and the surgeon's role, which was huge. This was not done before. And it was kind of creating, like I said, a new brand of doctor. Now, when I was learning all of this, my main question and what I wanted to get to the bottom of was, where did women fit in this role? Where did women belong? And even though that women were excluded from attending these medical universities, they did participate in medical culture. And they would do this by like exploiting resources that were available to them in the private sphere. And so they were able to make scientific discourse and treat patients alongside male counterparts. And we kind of see this if we look deeper into like the medical marketplace at this time. So like I mentioned earlier, cures and treatments for venereal disease saturated the medical marketplace. It's estimated that between the 1600s to 1800s, there were roughly 300 publications that covered venereal disease and the advertisements for venereal disease cures. And we know that women healers likely treated more patients than we can know of today. And that is because if we're going to this kind of like polite society and in this time period, women were very hesitant to see a doctor of the opposite sex. So having a practitioner of the same gender allowed these women to be treated. And this kind of falls in line with the stigma surrounding venereal diseases and the need for medical privacy, which was rising during this concept of medical privacy. So your treatment, your diagnosis, the privacy to that just between you and the doctor, that was very much rising in this period. And so that the need for medical privacy came an even greater need for both male and female practitioners. So when women were seeking treatment for venereal diseases, they sought privacy, as telling someone of their infection meant sharing a deep secret that could wreck their position in society. It can wreck their relationships. And because of this, it led women to seek treatment from other women. And a male practitioner notes that women would rather face and suffer death than subject their exposed bodies to the male medical gaze. as, it was very improper for women to show their nude bodies to men that were not their husband. But with venereal diseases, the areas that are affected are those of the genitalia region. So you do have to expose to get treatment. Now, men at this time kind of realized that they could reach an untapped market if they involve a woman in their practice. And this kind of led to a cooperation, if you will, between men and women practitioners. And these ties were often formed kind of between families. So either between husbands training their wives on how to treat people or fathers training their daughters. And kind of like the best example I can give of this, and this was kind of like finding a jewel in the diamond in the mine, if you will, when I was doing research, was a example of this medical practice that was run by physician Peter Maris and his wife Elizabeth. So from them, we have 3 advertisements that were surrounding. And so in the first 2 of the advertisements, Peter states that if any woman be unwilling to speak to man, they may have the convenience of speaking with my wife, who is an expert in women distempers. And so this is kind of showing like, hey, like I understand completely if you don't want to speak to a man, but you still want treatment, come see me and you can see my wife, which shows that Elizabeth just had the same kind of level of medical knowledge as her husband. Now, that's so cool and interesting in itself, but what really stood out about this is the 3rd advertisement. And this actually took place after the death of Peter. Elizabeth was still in the medical practice. She was still running it. And she notes in this advertisement that, she did not shy away from like writing about female distempers, and she fully embraced her role in healing venereal diseases. And in the advertisement, it states that if any gentleman has any distemper not fit to be discoursed to a woman, he may speak to my son. So this just shows like the medical demand for, the same gender healers may have allowed, women to not only establish careers, but also help women take ownership of their sexual health, which was huge at this time because before this, they really didn't have that option. Now, we know that Elizabeth was not alone because out of 154 advertisements for medical practitioners that treated venereal diseases between 1660 and 1715, 19 of those featured women practitioners. So now you know all the background, and now we're going to get into some of the treatments itself. So this goes back to last episode that I did with Madame Leeson and how she and her companion sought a treatment of salivation. Now, in the early 18th century, salivation was one of the most common treatments for men and women that were infected with venereal disease, specifically syphilis. And this treatment was kind of one of the harshest that you could put your body through. So what salivation treatment called for was essentially for mercury to be either ingested through a pill, absorbed through the skin by an ointment made of mercury, or absorbed via mercury fumigation. The next step, so after you've consumed mercury of some form, the patient would be confined to a warm area where they would be wrapped in fabric to encourage sweating. And then what would happen after that is the physician looking after them would measure the saliva and sweat that the patients produced. Because, going back to the purgative theory, it was believed that the disease could be purged through all of this. On average, it was recorded that patients filled up several pint containers a day with their saliva alone. And furthermore, these treatments lasted anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks, with the patients repeating the mercury wrap, sweat, and spit process several times throughout this week. Now, we know today that exposure to heavy metals for an extended period of time can wreak havoc on the human body. And we know that mercury is toxic to humans because it can harm and erode the immune system, the nervous system, your kidney, and your livers. Historian Kevin Sienna, who, if you are interested at all in anything like 18th 17th century like medicine. He is your go-to person, and he is also such an amazing writer. I loved everything I read by him, but he details that patients undergoing salivation treatment reported permanent damage to their mouth, their teeth, internal pain, and intense nausea. And another physician at this time recorded in his medical treatises that a person undergoing salivation is ever dejected and in low spirit, as one cannot find rest due to the constant state of having a noisome salver glides down into his stomach, making him sick and subject to puke. And under salivation, palsies, numbness, deafness, traction of the jaw are often unhappy consequences. And this treatment was by no means kept a secret to the public. The public knew of it. So much so that there was a ballad titled The Phlegm Pot. And it was written down at this time by a social performer. And he heard the song sung throughout the streets of London. And this song kind of describes what it is like to undergo salivation treatment at St. Thomas Hospital. And it goes, "And when this way you have done your best, and your rotten corpse won't let you rest. At St. Thomas Hospital you are caressed, where you spit the phlegm pot over. As the phlegm begins to rise, the fever works at your eyes, and the death stool from your arse gut flies. Oh, then you feel no more." And so this kind of just perfectly describes like what you can expect from salivation treatment. So you're going to be producing enough saliva to overflow a pot. You sweat so much from the fever that you're trying to induce from your body that you feel like the sweat is literally coming from your eyes. And then the song ends with the singer revealing that the only way to not feel pain from this treatment is when death comes to claim you. Now, salivation would lose popularity in the medical marketplace, and Kevin Sienna really credits this to the development to sufferers that those suffering from this disease, they wish for more confidentiality and a desire for shorter treatments. It also comes to do with surgeons who are becoming very much aware of the harmful effects of mercury and salivations had on the human body. And so kind of to mark on Kevin Sienna's point, it's like these treatments, they were done, and when you go to my Instagram for this, I'll show a picture. They were done in large rooms. And so you knew everyone there was suffering the same disease as you were. There was no privacy. Also, these treatments, like I said, they took 4 to 6 weeks, like at minimum. So that's a large chunk of your time that you were hosting to the disease. Now, those richer, and I did find in recipe books, you can do salivation treatments at the house, but it was not available in the large scale to the large masses. And a surgeon, John Andre, in one of his treatises over venereal disease, he would comment that salivation can really not be adapted in private, as very few patients would submit to such a severe mercurial course. And so now that we kind of have like that overview of one of the most popular treatments of this period, it's really important to note that when we're talking about venereal disease treatments from this period, that there is no real cure for them in the 18th century. Historian like Mary Thistle, she summarizes that hardly anyone was cured of an ailment in the early modern period. They endured, they survived, or they died. Now, this doesn't mean that the cures and treatments didn't provide some sort of relief for the sufferers from the symptoms, but it's really only trying to mask the symptoms and not get rid of the disease itself. And kind of the mark of good medicine at this period was that it provoked the body into healing itself. So once again, kind of going with that humor theory is, if you get rid of enough of the bad humors, the body is eventually going to heal itself. This is can be seen in I believe it was Surgeon Neville in his medical treatises. He explained that a disorder is known by its symptoms, so the removal of those symptoms is the cure for the disease, which we know in today's age that that is not the case. You can cure the symptoms, but the disease can still stay and linger. And secondly, it should really be noted that there was no single accepted universal treatment to cure syphilis or any other venereal disease in this period. Every remedy and every treatment varied from practitioner to practitioner. And so that means that the dosage can be different. The exposure to mercury can be different. Everything varies. There's no universal truth. And that became very evident when I was looking through all of these medical treatises. It's not like today where you get diagnosed with an STD and they give you a shot of antibiotics or penicillin or anything like that. Go to any doctor. You could go to any 5 doctors and they could all tell you 5 different things what to do. So a main controversy among these medical treatises that I noticed was the use of mercury and injections as a form of treatment. And as much as mercury played an active role in venereal treatment, it was not really a widely accepted cure-all. Therefore, like the dosage amount, the application, and the use are all highly contested in treating venereal diseases in this period. And kind of regarding mercury in these treatments, the practitioners tend to fall into one of 3 categories. The first was mercury cures all, that's the only thing we should use. The second were those of, mercury should not be used at all. And the third is kind of the middle ground of like, yes, we should use mercury, but that should not be your only thing you're doing. And so kind of like going like an example of a medical practitioner at this time who supported, mercurial treatments was a surgeon, Mr. Goulard. And in 1772, he stated in his treatises that there is no other cure but mercury for venereal diseases, and it is his preferred method. And he did this through a thing called mercurial frictions. And so what this was, it's kind of a less extreme version of salivation. He ordered his patients to receive at least 18 baths both morning and night. After exiting the bath, patients applied mercurial frictions to each other under the supervision of a surgeon. And so essentially what these frictions were, it was mercury that was really well grounded and very well mixed with water. And then they would apply that all over themselves and get it into the skin and then bathe it off. But it's important to note, it was the patients applying the mercurial friction, not the surgeon. So the surgeons didn't touch it. It was all in the patients. And he made it also very clear, Goulard did, that, and he heavily emphasized that it's important to not let these frictions turn into salivations, because if you go to salivations, that's too far, but a friction is fine. And because he noted it himself that salivations are very torturous to the patient. Then there is another physician who very much agreed. And he said in his 1797 treaty that, he has taken much pains to find any well-authentic case where venereal disease was cured without the use of mercury. That was proven unsuccessful. He wasn't able to find one. And he states that mercury is the most useful of all the materials. And he says that he is contemptible to any physician who believes they can practice medicine without mercury. He even goes as far as saying if you are suffering with venereal disease and you have been using mercury and you're not cured by it, then it's the patient's fault, not the mercury, which is kind of wild. He would never, I know there's cases of today where that would be saying that oh, I'm so sorry, this antibiotic is not working. It's because you're doing it wrong, not because the antibiotic is not right. Now, not all medical practitioners agreed with these 2 men. And going back to John Andre in his treaty, he believed that mercury actually does very little to help cure for it. And he only believed in using mercury for the treatment of, it was called choroides, which is a curvature in the penis that was caused by venereal disease, and buboes, which was a painful swollen lymph nodes that were found in the urethra and groin area. And even then, and this was a very common treatment as well, and kind of why I'm glad I was not a man in this period, is that with the buboes, a lot of medical practitioners at this time, a very common thing that I noticed throughout was they would actually cut them out. So what they would do And this is kind of like my funniest story from grad school is I was doing research at a coffee shop, as one does, and I was with my friends, and I was reading this medical treatise, and surgeon in it was kind of warning against the improper use of cutting buboes. And how they would do it at this time is one of the methods is they would take this very, very, very thin rod, and at the end it would kind of like was flattened out to look like a spoon, and then the end of that like spoon shape was serrated, so it was really sharp. So what they would do is they would stick that rod up the urethra and kind of like a melon scooper, carve out the infected buboes. So I was telling my friends this, and in this medical treatise I was reading, the doctor had a patient who had an infected buboes, and he was trying to get the rod up and couldn't get it past, but he felt in his heart that he could get it past. So he rammed it up there. He was able to get the buboes out, but essentially what happened is it caused his body to go into shock and infection set in. And so the man essentially ended up dying of infection and shock. So he warned against, essentially, he's like, you never want to force the rod. If you feel any need to force it, just stop. And so I was telling my friends this because I couldn't believe it. And there just so happened to be a man sitting next to the table next to us. And I saw him literally have a look of disgust. He closed his laptop and he left the coffee shop. But I thought the story was hilarious, and so did my friends. But yeah, that is one of the reasons I am really glad I was not a man dealing with this, because typically they would only do this like kind of rod insertion on men. Anyways, going back to Andre, what he believed to be like kind of the most successful thing with treating VD was cooling purges, temperate diet, moderate use of diluting liquids, and a skillful use of injections for a duration of 6 weeks. And kind of when we're talking about injections, what that means is essentially, and I will do a whole case over Blackbeard because he suffered from syphilis and he did this, but they would essentially take a syringe, fill that syringe up with mercury, and then take that and inject that into the urethra of the penis. So once again, I am glad I am not a man in this period dealing with STDs, because that is not fun. And so this was kind of like Andre's. He's like, if we do cooling purges, a temperate diet, and a skillful use of injections, because there were some doctors who also agreed that, and we'll get to Surgeon James Neville, because he also agrees that, you know, mercury should not be used and relied upon solely for the cure of venereal disease. And mainly because he says that those who use mercury tend to do it in very unsafe amounts. And James Neville said, like, the best way to do it, that the best way to remove venereal disease is through diuretics. Like, even purging, while it may be successful in removing the disease, can still wreak havoc on the quality of the body. And there were some surgeons who also felt like, you know, we should get rid of mercurial treatments altogether, just because of how badly it wrecks the body. And the surgeon Thomas Bayford in his treaty really, really spoke about this. And he was speaking about it in the case of the injections, like I talked about. So filling up that syringe with mercury and injecting it into the urethra. And he said this not only like very much harms the body, but it also like is very harmful and irritating to the urethra itself. And what he argued for is that the overall health and well-being of the patient should not be endangered by the venereal disease treatment. And that was his main focus of like, what good is a cure if it is going to do more harm to the patient than good? And so this is kind of like all encompassing and what is setting up kind of this like medical marketplace. And this is very much in the public sphere of things, of where you can get treatment. I also found that through my research of looking at recipe books, which I may do a whole episode over recipe books. It's not a difficult topic to talk about, but it's one that needs a lot of visualization. But essentially in these recipe books, I have found cases of and recipes for some venereal disease cures. So it is found that women were also doing these treatments at the house and treating not only themselves but family members for it. Now, this is all, like I said, 18th century. Mercury would still be used throughout the 19th century as a very heavily cure-all for venereal disease. There's a very common saying of like one night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. And I can't remember. There is also another saying that essentially, I was watching this show called The Alienist, which is a great show, but it's more so like Victorian era, Gilded Age of these mercury pills that had known effects of making your teeth either fall or have like a mercury-esque sheen to it. Venereal disease would always be a rampant thing until we actually end up getting the antibiotics and penicillin for it. And I'm going to do a whole episode over this as well, but come World War I, we actually see venereal disease kind of weaponized and used as a means to control and police women, specifically like prostitutes and lower class women during World War I. That is a whole interesting topic, and I think I will do a whole episode over that later on. I want to, for future episodes, I always find like medical treatments and how medical practices were done throughout different centuries and different eras so interesting. So I think, going to continue that. I want to do a whole period over ancient history and kind of I may do one over the 60s, over where we get the rise of the chiropractic practice. But anyways, that is today's episode. So sorry for all the delays. And if I sound nasally, it's because I can't breathe through my nose. But thank you so much for listening along. Be so thankful that we have come such a long way in the cures for STDs. And if you like this episode, like it, share it, subscribe it, rate it. I love all the interactions and like getting to know you guys better. Anyways, thank you so much, and I hope you have a good one. Bye.